Hello, everyone. Welcome to the May 28th edition of the Scientific Governance and Risk Meeting. My name is Richard Brown. I'm the head of community development at MakerDAO. And finally, after a long and tense wait, I am no longer the only governance facilitator at MakerDAO. This is a big day for me because governance has evolved in many, many ways over the course of the last year and a half, 2 years. It's become fantastically complicated, which was the plan, I guess. Let's call it sophisticated, to be charitable. There's lots and lots and lots of things to do. There's lots of threads to be managed. There's issues like consensus and debate and coordination. It's a large project. And I'm wearing a few different hats. And frankly, I do not have the bandwidth to devote to the attention that what's happening here actually deserves. And I've not felt great about that. So I've been enormously interested in expanding the pool of resources that the community has available to itself, for itself, in order to make sure that this governance machine keeps on running. Happily, the hero we needed arose in the time of our greatest need. LongForWisdom showed up, and it turns out that this is the best possible of all universes. He's interested in governance. He helped out. He basically just kicked ass in general, and through the powers of meritocracies and open governance and all kinds of yeah. I'm super laying it on thick for LongForWisdom because I'm still debating on whether I'm going to demand that he gives us an acceptance speech, but we'll see what my mood is like in the next 30 seconds. He just blew me away, and being willing to step up and adopt the responsibilities of governance facilitator is no small thing. Frankly, in many ways, it's a thankless job. The amount of work that is involved with doing it is tremendous, but there's all kinds of plus sides to this. Is that it's absolutely fascinating work. Being at the forefront, this is one of the things that MakerDAO is kind of really good at, is being at the sort of the leading edge of the curve. And so we're doing things that haven't been done before, or at least at this scale, I suppose. And that's a fascinating place to be. There's a lot of interesting problems to be solved. And I think that having somebody like LongForWisdom come along with the capacity and the insight to help us navigate this new world is a fantastically huge win for the ecosystem. So I am enormously happy to announce that he is now, well, let's not stand on too many formalities. Let's just call it now. Maybe it's on Friday, but in my mind, he is now the other governance facilitator, potentially outranking me because I'm just an interim governance facilitator and he's a real one. Yeah, and the other thing I wanted to point out too is that the way in which he was ratified involved an executive vote. And executive votes are non-trivial. In order for those to occur, people need to pull out their hardware wallets and they need to move value around on chain. And he, $25 million worth of Maker moved from one location to another over the course of 3.5 days, I think, in order to ratify him. So that shows that the ecosystem has valued his contributions as well. So this is a very, very encouraging day for all of us. Yeah, actually, I'm going to give him a pass. We'll see whether he gives us a speech or not. I think it's going to go something like, thanks, I guess. And then he's going to jump right into business, but we'll see how it goes. On the agenda for today, we have governance at a glance from the aforementioned LongForWisdom. Mariano Conti has been pulled into other business, so we're going to bump his housekeeping talk to next week. Nik is here to give us a talk about, or an update on what's happening in the Oracle world. Some light feed applications. Charles will give us the weekly MIPs update, and then soon after we'll jump into the actual MIPS order of business for this week, which I've immediately foisted onto our brand new governance facilitator. So I'm looking forward to that. And Vishesh will give us a state of the peg. Our agenda is fairly light today, comparatively, I suppose. which means that we'll have some more opportunity for Q&A sessions potentially. So if people have a topic that they would like to discuss, give it some thought over the next 10 or 15 minutes, and then we can start digging into some issues, because we have issues. For example, let's think about things like, and I know something that I see coming up over and over again is liquidations, and how do we deal with IOU tokens in the protocol. So stuff like that, larger threads that may have been raised recently but never exhaustively explored. So give us some thought, please. With that, oh yeah, maybe I should do some preambles too. If you have a microphone, please feel free to jump in and ask a question. If you do not, please type your question in the sidebar, and we will do our best to identify it and read it up for you. All right, with that, I am going to hand it off to you. Should I call you Mr. LongForWisdom? LongForWisdom, governance facilitator number 2. It's all yours.
All right. So I'll briefly thank everyone for the, I guess, trust they placed in me by voting for me as the second governance facilitator. It's very gratifying, so thank you. Expect, like, for the first few weeks, things are maybe going to be slightly more chaotic as me and Rich figure out how we are like splitting things, and who is doing what. But hopefully, like, once that period's over, we'll like be able to get more stuff done more consistently. So yeah, look forward to that, I guess. Cool. Should I go straight into governance at a glance, Rich? There's nothing else, right?
Yeah, sounds good. Thanks for that rousing speech, though.
Yep. I put my all into it.
Yeah, governance at a glance.
I was like frantically googling like famous speeches earlier, like trying to figure out if I could just like adapt any, but I only had like half an hour's notice, so I was like, I figured I Have a Dream was maybe like a bit over the top.
All right.
Cool.
You get a pass.
All right, governance at a glance then. Cool, yeah, so there's been a fair few discussions and a couple of signal requests which have popped up in the last week. So let's see. First, Primosh wrote up a nice little post about business policy of rate setting, like discussing the factors that affect how we set rates, so like monetary policy, risk, and specifically highlighting like the third one, which is sort of business policy and competitiveness in terms of how we set rates. Which I thought was really interesting and well worth a read. Let's see, we had a post where Late Tot shared some concerns over bundling monetary policy and governance process votes into the same executive. As it turned out, that executive was actually a sort of mistype, but obviously this has happened in the past. So it's good to see, well, not good to see, but it's interesting to see that other people share some concerns over the, trying really hard to be neutral now, share some concerns that some people have over how the executive voting works. And interestingly, Rune made a post in that thread where he shared sort of the mechanism by which we would potentially update the like governance paradigm or the technical governance system we have. Basically talking about how we would, the sort of the easiest way to update things would be to write a spell that was designed to always be active and then build the entire governance system on top of DSChief, which I thought was interesting because I was previously assumed that we'd have to migrate everything from DSChief to somewhere else. So that was cool. Let's see, Mike from Wire posted a post discussing how to quantify centralized stablecoin risk, which I thought was pretty interesting as well. Just talking about using regulatory recourse as sort of like an input into how risky certain stablecoins are, which again got some good discussion. So I think that mostly covers the discussions. So seeking consensus then, we had 2 more signal requests this week. We had one from Andy McCall, which is the first one he's done. So thanks for that, Andy, if he's here, I'm not sure. yeah, so the signal request covers modifying the regular weekly monetary policy votes to use the newly created ranked choice voting model, essentially, which seems to be fairly popular so far, if I remember rightly.
Can you give a brief recap of what ranked choice voting is?
Yeah, I can. Well, actually, Sam says that might be better, or Derek might be better to explain it. Sam, do you want to talk about instant runoff and how it works? Because I can't remember.
Yeah, okay. Putting me on the spot a bit here.
Yeah, sorry, I can't remember either.
Yeah, so ranked choice voting is a different version of voting compared to first past the post, which we've been using, where the option with the highest plurality will win the vote overall. And ranked choice instead allows you to select multiple choices. You can say, this is my first choice, this is my second choice, this is my third choice. And with instant runoff voting as the algorithm to determine the winner, it will eliminate the choices that are least popular and then reallocate the votes to second choice, third choice, until an over 50% majority winner emerges. So this is helpful for votes where there's more than two options to pick from. So the two options, which are a lot of the yes/no ones, first past the post and instant runoff ranked choice are equivalent. But for multiple choice, such as the fee votes, and in the past week, the vote that I put through where we had the base rate, and there was two variants of it. So ranked choice allows you to be more clear in what you prefer, which is nice.
Yeah, awesome. That was a great summary, Sam. Thanks. It's like frantically looking at Wikipedia while you said that. So yeah, all seems to check out. That's good. Thank you. Does that answer your question, Cyrus? Or... Cyrus? Yeah. Okay. I'm assuming that answered the question.
Sorry, I missed it. Could you?
I was just saying, does that answer your question?
Oh, yeah.
Any more details? Yeah, cool.
Yep, thanks.
Good. Okay. Right, so the other signal request we had was from Bit, who asked whether we should change the cadence of the base rate poll to monthly. So far, it seems like the majority of people prefer to keep it weekly. Some of the reasons were just because still sort of struggling to stabilize DAI, so perhaps having a monthly cadence would slow down our response time. And I shared the concern that we've only recently moved to the new stability fee structure, I guess. So it's probably, if we were going to increase the cadence, we should probably wait to see to make sure it works as expected, I guess. Cool. I think that is everything I wanted to talk about. Oh no, there was one more thing. So I wrote up a new guide to the signaling process, practical guide to the signaling process. So if you do feel like you're wanting to do a signaling thread, it's now slightly more clear what you should do in terms of technical options and like keeping people up to date, and just generally what's kind of expected if you decide to run one. So yeah, I think that's all of what I was going to say. Yeah, Sam, you're saying you wanted to go over the status stuff?
Yeah, could I do that quickly right now?
Yeah, the facilitator now, you can do whatever you want.
Nice. So I just wanted to run over quickly this thread that I put up about on-chain governance metadata. It hasn't really received any responses yet, but I think it's pretty important to address. So a problem I'm seeing emerge right now is as we add these additional layers of abstraction between the actual smart contract parameters and governance, it's not exactly clear how we keep track of these right now. So it started with the DSR spread, which is not an actual system parameter, but instead a governance construct. And so, and the next one that we just introduced last week was the splitting of the stability fees into the base rate plus the risk premium. And as well, I heard conversation this past week about wanting to put a cap on stable coins, like an overall debt ceiling cap on all stable coins, centralized stable coins rather. So as we sort of add these not code level sort of abstractions, I think it's helpful to keep track of these numbers on chain. So I wrote a thread discussing some possibilities about how to do this. And maybe the Maker dev team could weigh in on this a bit, because maybe they've already been thinking about this, but it just seems like a helpful thing to add.
Yeah, I can say we've had for a slightly different set of concerns, but we've had a ticket internally for creating an ILK registry on chain so that you can actually see the amount of collaterals that are there, because a lot of our spells are getting very long-winded and other people are going to have trouble sort of interacting without being able to iterate those on chain. It's a slightly different problem, but it's very similar in that we do need some type of on-chain source of these things, at very least to commit to the concept of those things and what they are. It would be nice to have that, and then beyond nice to have, like in the case of say an ILK registry, it's almost a necessity at a certain point. So yeah, people should consider it. It seems like it would be you know, the right technical move. So.
Okay, great. Yeah, I just wanted to draw attention to it. So that was it.
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate that. Like, I'd actually forgotten about that thread completely. So thanks for bringing it up again. All right, Rich, do we want to move on?
Yeah, I think so. It might be a good one to circle back on during the Q&A session too, because the idea of parameter oracles or authoritative roll-up of parameters, synthetic and real, on-chain would be super useful. It also ties into some issues we're having where there's a disconnect between the actual polls and what's in the wording of these markdown templates and what actually ends up on chain as well. So expanding the metadata there might be an interesting idea. But we will leave that for some free time in Oracle section. So Nick, let's hand it over to you and you can give us an update of what's going on with your world.
Sure. So I've been kind of quiet about Oracle stuff for a while, but the MIP, the new MIP system was like a really, really big deal for us, because MIP 10 basically covers all of the governance functionality that we kind of need. Whereas before we were kind of doing this like off the cuff, ad hoc, bespoke thing every single time. You know, now there's actual processes for these. So now when, say people approach us and are like, hey, we want to use your oracles, or hey, you know, we want you guys to create an oracle for, you know, X, it's really easy to just be like, well, here's MIP 10, go and post it on the forum and like you're all set. So that's been pretty big for us, and I think that'll start to become apparent in the coming weeks and months as we go through a lot more Oracle governance. So on the tangible side, maybe some of you have seen this, but DeFi Saver applied on the forums to be whitelisted on all of our collateral oracles for their kind of automation software. So that's the one that saves CDPs when they get below a certain threshold. So very important that we, in my opinion, that we support that, because it kind of helps prevent or minimizes the impact of issues like Black Thursday, right? Where we don't get mass liquidations because there are these third-party services that are already, you know, covering in distress kind of CDPs. Or excuse me, vaults. Now on the feed side of things, so just to recap, right? Feeds are the kind of data providers for oracles, right? So they're they're controlled, right? The membership of being a feed is controlled by governance, and there's both dark feeds, right, which are these anonymous entities, and there's light feeds, which are these public kind of organizations that are like stakeholders in the ecosystem. So currently, right, the light feeds are DYDX, 0x, Protocol, Gnosis, and the Maker Foundation. And we just got an application this week from Kyber, who also wants to run a light feed, which personally I think is a great thing. I think we need more light feeds, like we need more stakeholders in the ecosystem. And the more we have, right, the more we have this kind of decentralized web of trust, right? It still ends up being pretty much being a multi-sig, but multi-sigs have done pretty well, even as right, there hasn't been some order of magnitude evolution in replacing multi-sigs. So right, it's more of an incremental improvement in our current architecture of just getting more and more reputable organizations to run light feeds. So I'm already in talks with a couple kind of potential partners to kind of help them through the filing process, right? Filling out the MIP and where to kind of post it on the forum, which has kind of taught me that partners still need a lot of handholding. But I think that we're going in the right direction, because I can now just point to like an example and be like, oh, well, if you want a sample of what this is supposed to look like, look at Kyber's like light feed application, or look at DeFi Saver's whitelisting whitelisting application. So I think you'll find that in the coming weeks, you're going to see a lot more Oracle applications. So just wanted to make kind of people aware of that. And that's it from me. Oh, I see a question in the chat about enabling fees. Yeah, so back in September, right, we passed what we called the responsible Oracle migration proposal, right? And part of what was in that was effectively that we give Oracle services away for free from the day that the individual entity gets access to them. So that's still the case, right? If governance wants to have a vote to change that, right? Someone posts a proposal in the forum. But I think this is it's really helpful in one respect, because it helps us onboard a bunch of groups very kind of, it helps us onboard a bunch of groups that otherwise, if they had to pay for Oracles, wouldn't be able to necessarily pay for them right now. And it allows us kind of to get access to these like early stage companies that maybe down the road like are actually going to be, stalwart services of DeFi, but just need some time to bootstrap first. And I don't think that we should kind of be stalling kind of innovation in the space. I think there's a lot of DeFi applications that need Oracles, and if we can provide them, we probably should. Even if in the short term it doesn't make us that much money, I think in the medium term, we can start to institute some fees. We can either offset or our Oracle costs, or start to profit from them. I think the kind of free Oracle model right now is a good one to at least from a growth perspective.
So we had a couple more questions. Crispy asked, what's the cost to run an Oracle for a year? Not sure if he was talking about like stipend or like actual like sort of cost of running things.
So each of the feeds gets paid 1,000 DAI a month. And currently that's paid for by the foundation, but the intention is that when stability fees start to pick up again and governance has a stream of revenue, that the protocol is going to start paying for this. So those are kind of the major costs. Then you also have the gas costs for the relayers. So technically, everyone can run a relayer, and there are some game theoretic reasons for why you would run a relayer. Say if you're a keeper, or say if you are a speculator who wants kind of maximum leverage. But in the kind of short term, those aren't really enough, and you need kind of people who are just running these either on an altruistic basis or on a compensated basis. There's a bunch of partners who are running relayers. There's a bunch of Maker Foundation relayers. Like I'm running 1 or 2 relayers. I've always encouraged people to run them as well. But the ultimate thing is that there needs to be at least some relayers that have guaranteed uptime, because they are, you know, compensated by the protocol in some manner. Haven't quite thought through how that should work. But well, it's something on my to-do list. So given that, right, there's 20 feeds, so it's 20K a month times, you know, 12 months a year. It's about 240K a year. So I'd say costs are in that 240K to 260K mark annually. So the cool thing about kind of the Oracle business model is that, you know, to make a new Oracle, you know, there are some fixed costs, right? Like you need to spend developer resources to actually, you know, program that Oracle, and then you need to, you know, roll out the update to the feeds. You know, you need to make sure that update has been thoroughly tested, right? You need to then point the relayers to it, and you have this now kind of extra fixed gas cost. Not fixed in the sense that gas prices don't fluctuate, but fixed in the sense that every new Oracle you add, you have minimum some number of gas units annually that you're going to be adding to your expenses. But the cool thing here is that, you know, to whitelist more entities, kind of, it costs us nothing, right? So from a kind of a profit perspective, right, the more people you can get whitelisted on a single Oracle, you know, the more kind of your per customer costs are coming down. Or, you know, from another perspective, the more profit you can make off of that Oracle. Okay, I'm seeing some other questions. Can you describe what it means to have access to an on-chain Oracle? So access is basically you get governance puts an entity on the whitelist, and the whitelist lets people read the Oracle price. So right now, if you're not on the whitelist, you actually can't read the Oracle price from the V2 Oracles.
Just to specify, that's on-chain, like contracts can't read the Oracle price. Obviously,
yeah.
I think just reading the blockchain can do whatever it wants, right?
Yeah, everyone reading the blockchain off-chain can do whatever they want, but we're not really. Anyone reading the blockchain can also just query the Coinbase price. So that's not really the business that we're in.
Yeah, for sure. Just wanted to clarify.
Okay, I think that's it in terms of Oracle questions. Can I turn my cap around? This is not the famous die cap. No, this is my soccer team. Okay, all right, thank you guys.
All right, thanks, Nick. Charles, I think we're going to turn it over to you to give us this week in MIPs, and then Long can dive into the official MIPs business, I think.
Perfect. Yeah. So this week's activity, the executive vote to effect LongForWisdom went out on Monday, and the vote passed today. And now LongForWisdom is officially a governance facilitator. So his proposal can now officially be marked as accepted, and alongside the other 13 and 2 sub-proposals. Additionally, on Monday, we had the first community Greenlight polls published. Just to clarify some things, the polls will indeed run for 2 weeks as of Monday. There was a little confusion about why they would run for 2 weeks, as MIP9 has a few inconsistencies in the language. But I just want to say that in general, the thought behind the 2-week period is to give people that aren't necessarily as active in the governance process a chance to vote, also to provide forum updates, as well as display current results over the course of 2 weeks so that people can be more updated. But with that being said, I do plan to propose an amendment to make them last the last 2 weeks of the governance cycle. and correct certain inconsistencies, as well as to make it ultimately work better with the governance cycle flow. So I'll get into more amendment details later in this update, but basically it's going to talk about how we plan to clarify and update the MIPs to be more consistent across the board. So as for today's business, the governance facilitator or facilitators will perform a governance cycle review that they feel is necessary, in which they summarize and discuss the past governance cycle of May. This meeting can also be used as an opportunity to discuss any upcoming governance cycle or potential submissions for June's governance cycle. So with that, I'd like to do a little May governance recycle recap. So the first governance cycle is coming to an end. We've had the first MIP sub-proposal go through the governance process and get successfully ratified, which is a pretty big milestone, at least in my opinion. In terms of other proposals that kind of got introduced over the course of the month, we had MIP 13, the Declarations of Intent by LongForWisdom, MIP 14, Protocol Data Transfer by LongForWisdom as well, and MIP 15, the Dark Fix Mechanism by Will Barnes. So all of these proposals are currently under the request for comments phase, so don't forget to give feedback or request changes from the author so that they can work the fixes and better reflect the community's sentiments towards them. So lastly, as we went through the governance cycle, or the first governance cycle, we learned about what works and how to improve it for the future, especially related to collateral onboarding flow and making people more aware of the processes that are occurring over the course of a month. So I've drafted 4 amendment MIPs to address some of the confusions and make things more consistent, and ultimately make the governance cycle and collateral onboarding processes more efficient for everyone. So I'm going to propose these amendment MIPs later on today, hopefully, so that you can all dig into it on the forums. But right now, I'm just going to give a brief overview of what the changes would entail so that you can expect to see this in the forum post later. So the plan is to amend MIP 6, MIP 8, 9, and 12. So as for MIP 6, these changes will be to the requirements to more specifically highlight that they'll last for 2 weeks, and that after 2 weeks of posting the application, the collateral type is eligible for a community Greenlight poll. This removes the need to require domain Greenlight to occur before the community Greenlight poll. As for MIP 8, it will just be some tweaks to further the above point I just mentioned, as well as just making sure to effectively highlight that domain Greenlight should occur after the community Greenlight poll happens, allowing the domain teams to use the community Greenlight poll results to make a more informed decision and proceed with their domain work with the backing of community sentiment. As for MIP 9, this amendment proposes some minor language edits and separation of components. So taking the 2 components and separating them to 4 to further clarify, as well as address some of the inconsistencies that I've detailed earlier about MIP 9. So more specifically, this consists of information of the duration of the polls, when they occur, how long they occur for, and general updates regarding the scoring framework for the polls. So we also updated the poll template to better reflect and have more information available in the poll itself so that people can click on it when they go to vote. The last amendment is with respect to MIP 12. So this is the process where the domain teams bundle their work and submit a sub-proposal, including their work, to formally enter the governance cycle, ultimately going through the cycle, and if it gets ratified, the collateral type would be added to the maker protocol. So this consists of some changes just to MIP 12 to allow the collateral onboarding process to operate more efficiently. So as I mentioned, I will be formally posting these amendment MIPs. So what an amendment consists of is it's a MIP with the explanation of the intentions behind it, as well as a link to the PR that edits the active MIP in question. So I will be posting these, and I'm going to put them in the request for comments as soon as possible. And I do have the intention of proposing them for June's governance cycle so that we can get all these areas cleaned up and allow the future governance cycles to be more efficient as soon as we can. So in terms of next week's activities, this is the first week of the second ever governance cycle. On Monday, from June 1st to 4th, is the official formal submission period for June's governance cycle, where MIPs or sub-proposals in the request for comments phase can enter the governance cycle and wait for approval for the governance facilitators to formally start with the process in week 2 with an inclusion poll. Next Thursday, the governance facilitators will do the submission review from the Monday as part of the governance meeting, in which they'll determine which of the proposed MIPs are in accordance with the guidelines defined in MIP 0, and if they should ultimately get included in the inclusion poll. So in other news, I'm going to talk a little bit about collateral onboarding. So both the TUSD and USDCB governance polls passed successfully today, meaning that they will go for an executive vote. So note that these assets are still following the weekly cycle and not the monthly governance cycle, as I previously mentioned. And this is because we're kind of still in this transition period from the current collateral onboarding practices to the full MIPS process. You can check out the results on the voting dashboard. Given that the community Greenlight poll results will conclude on May 28th, in 2 weeks, the MIP 12 proposals that include the domain work for the agreed upon collateral assets will not be ready for June's governance cycle. So it'd be more likely that they enter July's governance cycle. And since I got some questions about the community Greenlight poll scoring, I wanted to go over it briefly. So the score is the yes votes minus the no votes. And if a score is greater than 0, it is effectively greenlit. And if it is less than 0, it is deferred. So in summary, the community Greenlight polls provide this reasonable first approximation of which assets the domain teams should prioritize going forward and which ones they should work on. However, this prioritization is ultimately not binding on the domain teams, and the domain teams are free to determine the order in which they perform the domain work for the assets that have passed community Greenlight. So that covers the weekly update. Again, I'll post this update that I've just gone over on the forums as usual, and also keep an eye out in Rocket Chat in the forums for the amendments that will come out later today or tomorrow.
Okay, LongForWisdom, do you want to pick up the official MIPS order of business for the week?
Yeah, I can do. Charles covered it a little bit already, but I'll go through it briefly.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, so week 4 of the governance cycle is the governance cycle review, in which the governance facilitators summarize and discuss the previous governance cycle and potentially open the discussion to the sort of floor to discuss the upcoming governance cycle and what might or might not be in it. So in terms of the last governance cycle, there was one sub-proposal, which is on board me as governance facilitator. So I mean, I haven't got a sort of great idea of what we should do in these sort of summaries, but at least I can kind of go through the different polls that happened and like sort of what sort of participation they got, what sort of weight of maker landed on each poll. So I think I'll do that briefly. So we start with the inclusion poll, where we had 20 unique voters. We had a yes. The yes weight was like 5.7k maker, and no was 400 maker. So there's quite a lot of participation in that one. As these things go. The second poll, which was so normally this would be the bundled poll, which included everything that was in the inclusion poll, but in this case it was just the same poll again, essentially. So that only had 9 voters and had 5,000 maker weight on yes and 0 maker on no. So it's kind of interesting to see the amount of voters drop off on this. I suspect in this case it was because it was mostly the same as the previous vote, but we'll kind of pay attention to what sort of participation levels the various stages of the governance cycle get as we go forward. And then the last stage was to do the executive, which ended up with 70k maker in support, most of which landed in the last day today. Yes. So yeah, like overall, I think it was a reasonable participation level for the first governance cycle. Hopefully, so ideally next cycle we'll see more than one thing, more than one MIP or sub-proposal be added to the cycle. So the inclusion poll will actually be more meaningful in that it'll determine what is included in the cycle. So yeah. Does anybody have any thoughts on the upcoming MIPs? Charles briefly went over them, but to go over them again, there was MIP 13, which is MIP I wrote, called Declarations of Intent. There is MIP 14, which I also wrote, called Protocol Die Transfer. And there's MIP 15, which Will Barnes wrote, and concerns like dark fix protocol, I guess, or dark spell protocol.
As for MIP 15, I believe it will be going
in, yes, right.
I was just going to say, yeah, it's not going to be going to the June cycle. It's going to follow the request for comments phase detailed in MIP 0, which is 3-month-long period, because it's not officially like a MIP 2 proposal. So that's that.
Yeah. So yes, you're correct. So to clarify, MIP 2 is the MIP that states that the feedback and frozen periods can be skipped essentially for the first few months after all the MIPs get ratified, which is like optional again. So yeah, in terms of MIPs 13 and 14, I haven't fully decided if they're going to go into the next governance cycle yet. There's still some discussion on MIP 13 specifically. I think MIP 14 will probably go in. MIP 13, I'm unsure about. I don't know how many people here have read it, but if anyone has and wants to comment, feel free. Rich, was there anything you wanted to discuss about the upcoming governance cycle or the previous governance cycle?
No, but thank you for asking. One of the things I would like to devote some time to, and I'm not sure whether we can do it now or afterwards, but your two MIPs that you submitted are fairly weighty, and I think I've discussed this in the past, that they have some fairly broad implications for the ecosystem. I'm not saying ecosystem, for the protocol and for the governance environments. I don't necessarily want to put you on the spot though immediately. Strangely, usually I love doing that. So maybe next week, or do you want to talk about it after the top of the hour in the Q&A session? Maybe.
Yeah, I can talk about it whenever.
Okay, yeah, cool. I'd love to do that because for the uninitiated, LongForWisdom put two MIPs into the process that allow, well, they're wrapped in a lot of very fancy-ish language, but basically it allows the community a level of autonomy that it's never enjoyed in the past, and there's some significant implications there. Most of them are all positive. It allows the community to come up with an idea. They want to do something. Frequently, the community is kind of hamstrung because the question becomes, well, who's going to pay for that? This set of MIPs answers that question. And depending on how mercenary you view the world, you need to have your own funds in order to have true autonomy. And this is a method that allows that to happen. It also is potentially fraught with peril and has some sharp edges that we should all sort of internalize and maybe some brainstorming about how to fix those things. So actually, maybe Lonky, if you wanted to post the links to those in the sidebar, maybe people can bone up in the next 11 minutes while we talk to Vishesh and go over the state of the pegs. Vishesh, you all set?
Yes, you just have to click over tabs. Takes a year.
I can only imagine the amount of tabs an intellect like yours would generate. It's terrifying.
Make him a co-host as well.
Oh yeah, I forgot about that. All right, you have presentation powers now.
Okay, It's a lot of responsibility.
It is. It's tremendous.
All right, so at a glance, total DAI still around 120 million, DAI from ETH around 105, DAI from USDC down to about 5, DAI from WBTC up at 9.5, and the DAI from BAT is still roughly 500,000. So let's click in a little bit more specifically. So this is the last 30 days of DAI's performance. Basically, at the end of April, beginning of May, obviously DAI was at an elevated price, started to come down. We talked last week about this little ETH reversal, kind of throwing DAI for a loop. And then basically it had started to come back down, had touched and even dipped below peg. And then ETH decided to play another little game. So just as it was coming down, ETH took a dip and then jumped back up. That actually caused the reverse effect from what it had been doing over the past, I would say, month and a half. So basically, as ETH started to come up, this time around, DAI actually did its inverse behavior. Last time ETH dipped and then came back up, DAI had exhibited a positive correlation, but this time it resumed its normal negative correlation. So what this means is, as ETH started to pump, people actually did take some leverage and sold some DAI, which helped to bring it back down a little bit. And then immediately thereafter, the ETH price started to come back down. So the DAI price resumed its peg. Kind of funny, but it basically illustrates why DAI has this negative correlation to ETH in sort of normal scenarios, and then when it starts to exhibit this positive correlation, it's actually a potentially riskier scenario. So the ETH price then in the last couple of days started to come back down a bit, and the DAI price started to rise a bit, and now they're sort of back dancing in perfect lockstep with negative correlations, as the ETH price sort of started to reverse its dip again. ETH has kind of been wobbling basically over the past couple of months, and now DAI is starting to sort of wobble in coordination. So that's actually a potentially good sign, because it means that leverage behavior is now no longer just sensitive to sentiment or global perceived risk for crypto, or system specific risk for Maker or anything like that. It's now sort of resumed a total market price dependency, which means that people are once again willing to lever up, and they're willing to speculate and trade. So confidence appears to have been restored, but it's still early. So that's something to watch. So as far as these DAI supplies, so WBTC, we talked about shortly after it was added, jumped up to about 4.5 million. Well, it jumped up again in the last week to about 9.5 million. So this is actually seeing some very solid utilization. ETH DAI, so the OG has kind of been slowly growing since March, and it's kind of holding steady in the last week or so at around 104, 105 million. USDC, so USDC, what we saw was initially for the March events, there was about 7.5 million in utilization. This came back down after that was no longer a necessary use case, and then was sitting fairly low until it was made significantly cheaper. and then B, there were some large refinancings, and so from Compound, and so essentially this kind of topped out around 11 to 13 million with some fluctuation, and it was just sort of sitting at around 10 million. And then around the 20th, which I believe conversations had started about a slight increase to stability fee, and then also around the 20th is when we had this sort of decline in the ETH price. What we saw was basically a large refinancing. I believe they went back to Compound, but I would have to check on that, of about 3 million, and then a couple of smaller ones just in the last 24 hours or so. So the USDC DAI supply has come down a bit, but that sort of makes sense considering that prior to the 24th, it was like literally free money. But you know, given the system parameters with how it is for liquidations, and the fact that it's a, you know, short term appears to be a fairly low risk, low volatility risk collateral type, it was very attractive for people to be using this. And it still is very attractive, just very, very slightly less so. So it'll be interesting to watch like how much utilization this gets, and what really causes it to change, because it appears to be very sensitive. It's just an interesting detail. So yeah, that collateral supply sort of, this was actually much more stagnant than the DAI supply. So it seems those that were using the USDC DAI pool don't move the amount of collateral that much. What they're really fluctuating is the amount of DAI that's minted from it. So they're sort of more than happy to keep that USDC parked and then utilize it more heavily as needed. But there was, you know, about a $3 million USDC dip on the 26th to the 27th. So just to touch on the relative collateralizations of each of these different assets. So ETH has kind of maintained this semi-trimodal distribution of collateral ratios. So a decent chunk at 200 to 250, a decent chunk at 300 to 350, and a decent chunk at 500 plus, and then basically smaller distributions for the interceding values, which probably means that, and that's sort of coincides with sort of 1, 2, 3 main sections of the liquidation walls that you see. So that probably represents multiple different risk profiles embedded within the same asset. So as ETH starts to diversify into multiple risk profile offerings, as in multiple ETH collateral types, you probably see these kind of become more uniform for each one, because people would probably segment out and basically seek the collateral type that matches their risk profile the best. But right now, they're all sort of bundled together in one. So that's kind of what we see from the distribution. There is a small wall at 138. So that's something to be aware of. Basically, if this dips, you know, I mean, it looks pretty dramatic on this graph, but if this price dips to about here, you would see a significant amount of liquidations, but that is seemingly far off from where we're at now. And I think a lot of users are perceiving this as like a low risk scenario, especially given that ETH appears to be pumping right now. I'm not sure it's necessarily worth going into the collateralization of WBTC, but I'll do it anyway. Just to take a moment to update. But yeah, let me just touch on one other thing. So in the last 7 days, what we basically saw was similar but slightly less ETH DAI trading volume from the previous 7-day time frame. And what we saw was basically just a more dramatic share of that trading on DYDX than even before. A bit less on Coinbase, a bit more on Uniswap, and then basically slightly less on Oasis. So a lot of DYDX activity. But globally, this is a bit, low in terms of trading volume for a 7-day time frame. So even though this peg appears to be functioning well, it is definitely lower volumes than we've potentially seen in the past. So I would take the weighting with a grain of salt. Just go to USDC. So as far as USDC goes, obviously just huge chunking at about 5 points above the liquidation threshold. And then a smaller chunk that's like, 20 points over collateralized. So that's actually very interesting. But people keeping a little bit of a buffer of USDC, like I said, they just wiped down some USDC debt, but I think they're still comfortable keeping USDC parked for when they need it. Let's go back to here. Okay. So yeah, this was the 90-day time frame. So the point was to show that though the prices were crazier, there was much heavier volumes in April and early May than we've seen in the last 2-3 weeks. So though the prices do look better, definitely take that into consideration. And I think what will be interesting to watch in terms of DAI is some of these larger trades, where are they occurring? So the larger trades do encounter more slippage when there's lighter volumes. So, we saw some Uniswap trades going well below peg. And we saw some Uniswap trades going well above peg, obviously due to slippage, but they were some of the larger trades of the ones that were occurring. So that tends to move averages a bit more dramatically. I'll look to add in some stuff with the USDC DAI trades, hopefully for next time. So that'll be something that'll be good to look at. We'll see if WBTC wants to load. Otherwise, I will pass it back, Rich, if there's any questions.
There does seem to be a few questions, but I'm reasonably sure that some of these people have microphones. C. Mooney, did you want to ask your question?
Yeah, I was just wondering if in the graphs when we look at Uniswap, are we looking at V1 still, or is there a plan to add V2, or does it already combine them?
I believe it's already combined, but I can double check on that.
Actually, I think that is the end of the questions for you, Vishesh, that I can see. If I'm incorrect, please jump on the mic and ask. But thank you for that. Illuminating as always. We're at just past the top of the hour. So just like in the olden days, we were all wrapped up in 60 minutes, and we have an opportunity for a Q&A session. LongForWisdom, did you want to take it away and give us a recap of the implications behind your 2 minutes and what they're all about?
Yeah, I can do.
Cheers.
Cool. So the main implication of both of these MIPs is that it will be possible to spend DAI from the Maker protocol via executive vote, which has always technically been possible, but there's never been a clear process for the community to do that or to trigger that. So the main kind of fundamental impact is that we will now be able to spend DAI if we all vote for it, which, as Rich said, is a fairly major change. So yeah, I mean, MIP 14 is a fairly simply just that. You can define using a subproposal. You can create a subproposal. You can say pay this much DAI to this target address. This is the reason. Any supporting information or whatever can live in the sub-proposal. You know, you post it as you do any other sub-proposal. It gets discussed. Hopefully, it would go through the governance cycle. And if it made it to the week 4 executive in this governance cycle, then it would potentially transfer DAI out of the protocol to the target address. Cyrus, do you want to comment?
Sure. Just wondering what you think about the governance risk in having a discretionary spending account. I don't know if there could be like restrictions or kind of a series of checks and balances before payments actually go out, or
Yeah,
I don't know. Just seems like could be quite risky.
Yeah, so like ultimately, kind of so I feel like once we iterate on these things, we'll be able to kind of figure out what sort of checks and balances we need on this process. Because the kind of ultimate question is like, you know, what check or balance do we want to impose on ourselves, right? Because you're basically then saying that, I mean, yeah, again, like the ultimate thing is that through an executive, you can basically do whatever you want, right? So ultimately, maker token holders are always able to do whatever they want as long as they can find someone to code an executive for them. So I don't see the governance risk here as significantly different from any other governance risk, like the risk of governance attack generally. Like at some point, maker token holders have to become responsible for like managing, I mean, they're already responsible for managing the protocol, right? But like part of that responsibility is being able to use the tools that the protocol has, one of which is to spend DAI. So that's.
I have a question about this.
Sure.
Has there been any thoughts towards sort of like spam protection with this sort of stuff? Because it seems like this could maybe be susceptible to having a lot of low quality content come through, like maybe some sort of small fee or something like that.
That's not something I directly considered. So spam in general in the MIPS process is something that has been considered, and it's one of the reasons why the governance facilitators get to gatekeep like what goes into the inclusion poll. In that if there's just like too many things that have been submitted, then the governance facilitators can say, okay, well, these ones are just low quality, so we're just not going to vote on them, or there's too many, so we can only vote on 5 this week or 10 this week or whatever, or this month, sorry.
Okay.
So there's kind of generalized ones, but there could potentially be something like that in the actual, in this actual MIP. Potentially you could like refund the fee again to the address. It's kind of interesting because it's different. There's no way to really enforce that someone pays DAI to like post a MIP to the forum, right? There's no like smart contract logic that can stop people just posting whatever they want, really.
Yeah, but like we probably don't need it yet, but I'm just saying it could be a useful tool if this thing gets overloaded, just because there's money attached to it. Like, yeah, sure. I don't know, I see it as a potential vector for getting spammed.
Yeah, it definitely could be. I think the kind of issue is the first part of the MIPS proposal thing is to post something on the forum. So like you can't really force someone to pay something to post something on the forum. I mean, I guess you could sort of have as a social layer, like, you know, burn this much DAI and then we won't delete your proposal. Which is
that's kind of what I was thinking.
Yeah, that's a possibility. This is the sort of thing where I'd like to, where it's something I wouldn't want to like pre-optimize for, I guess, in that like.
Yeah, it was just a thought. I don't think it's necessary at this stage.
Cool. Appreciate the thoughts. All right, so Daniel in chat asked, is there a clear example of what the community would want to spend DAI on immediately? Hard to say, really. It's, I imagine, not something a huge amount of people have thought about. The one kind of glaringly obvious thing is that maker token holders voted to compensate the vault holders if that lost money through the zero bid auctions issues on Black Thursday. If that's to be done, then the DAI needs to come from somewhere. The protocol is kind of the only place. Sorry for saying that shouldn't be controversial, and it's like, yes, well, it probably will be, but cool. All right, so MIP 14 is kind of just a very simple like transfer mechanism, in that you make a subproposal transfer, goes through a process, it gets added to a list, so you can see all the previous transfers and all this sort of stuff. Discussion in that MIP there was some discussion about whether to put in some logic to try to prevent flop auctions from occurring. In that, obviously, if you try to pull out the protocol when there isn't enough DAI, then it will trigger flop auctions, for those that don't know. So there's a couple of options here. Like we could put something in the MIP specifically that says, that's kind of like logic to like spread out payments over time to avoid flop auctions. But again, it's sort of in the aim of kind of not prioritizing for things we don't necessarily want. I haven't included stuff like that. It's just like a very simple, like, if you suck out more DAI than is in the protocol, then it will print maker, because that's what it does to cover debt.
Wouldn't it be quite reasonable to say that you can't use this process for deficit spending? So if you actually are intending to trigger MKR dilution as a result of your DAI transfer, then that needs to be like a whole new thing from scratch, because it sounds pretty extreme to me to just sort of casually start minting MKR to pay for stuff.
Yeah, for sure. So I haven't put like a specific strict like thing. You can't do this in the protocol, because I kind of want it to be as generic as possible. For any individual proposal, like if it's going to mint maker, then you can kind of assume that everyone's going to be looking at it really hard and saying, "Are you sure you want to do this?" But that's kind of the onus is on maker token holders to pay attention to what is happening in the governance process, right? Like you kind of have to hope that no one's going to be able to push like a subproposal or MIP through without anyone reading it or knowing what it does.
I could still see value there, just in terms of setting expectations, and also in making this this whole process less contentious. Is that it sort of is limited to spending out of the available surplus, just because you're not necessarily opening the door to like anything can happen, but you're opening the door to, we can spend the money that we've saved up in these ways.
The kind of question I have then is like, is there ever a situation where you would want to do that, to spend money that we don't have? I can see there's potentially times when we would want to do that. So the question is, do you want to have a MIP process to do that, or do you want to have like no MIP process to do that? You could potentially define it as a completely separate MIP process if you wanted.
Yeah, I think I agree with you. It's just that given that that's such a much more radical decision, it seems like it's a bit harder to plan for it formally through a process, because a lot of people on this call might say, oh, we should actually literally never do that. And some people might say, well, only in very exceptional circumstances, and I couldn't even tell you what they were, and so on. So it just feels like it's harder to formalize, while spending out of the surplus is like probably not that controversial.
Yeah, that's fair. Yeah, I'd encourage you to sort of make comments to that nature on the MIP, and anyone else to add their thoughts. All right, so that was MIP 14, which is kind of very simple and kind of generic DAI transfer MIP. MIP 13 is a little more involved in that it allows, so it's called declarations of intent, and it allows governance to declare that they want something to happen, and then to put up like a number, like a bounty, to say like, this is how much we will pay if this happens, and you are the person or you are the group that has done it. And then sub-processes for managing all those things. So the major comments on this MIP have been that the kind of like bounty like payment system is like kind of very primitive, which I agree with, in that it doesn't really have any considerations towards like paying in advance or paying like half first or paying for milestones or anything like that. It's very much just like, this is what we want to happen, this is how much we're going to pay for it, and once you've done it, then we will send you the money. So there's some discussion about whether to take the MIP as is, or whether to take the MIP without the bounty parts. So you can just say governance wants this to happen, but not attach money to it. Or whether to go with what's kind of there as the primitive bounty system, and then try and improve it later once it becomes more obvious what the problems with it are. So if anyone has any questions about that, feel free, or leave comments on the forum on MIP.
I have a question for the monetary policy for any of the market makers that are on the call. DAI price has been like strangely just above $1, but hasn't quite broken through, and the volatility seems to have dropped significantly. Is there like a massive hidden bid right at $1 that's kind of preventing this, or has it just been abnormally slow on the vault creation and supply generation side of things? It's been like a couple weeks where it's just hovering right above that dollar mark. It doesn't quite break down.
I would think the USDC buffer is kind of blocking that. That's my thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's kind of what I think too. Especially because there aren't any large resting bids on Coinbase. So it seems like any medium-sized order should have pushed the price below $1, but it's not happening. So I'm just assuming that there's a fair amount of hidden bids probably from the USDC folks, USDC vault owners, trying to cover. I want to see curious if the market makers have any anecdotal thoughts on that.
I mean, I agree with your analysis, so that's my only comment.
Yeah, I mean, it just makes sense that considering, you know, so many people's inventories were cleared out over the course of a month, that they'd be looking for opportunities to replenish those. And I think that's why, you know, there have been 2 incidents in the last month or so where DAI has gotten close to or dipped below briefly. And in both of those, you know, it appears to immediately have snapped back. So I would presume that there's a fair degree of orders just below $1, just waiting to replenish inventories.
Yeah, I think I might be at my breaking point. Too much awkwardness. So I think that we've hit the end of the Q&A session. It was a really cool call, though. I'm looking forward to the future with the now doubled capacity for governance throughput on the facilitator end of things. Thanks, Nick, for your presentation. Thanks, Sam, for your recap as well. Thanks, LongForWisdom, and everybody else who asked questions. Vishesh, as always. Your graphs are a delight. All right, thanks everybody. Posting this to YouTube soon, and y'all can enjoy it there for a second time. All right, bye everybody.